Thank you very much. Good to see you. I should have actually said, instead of nurturing entrepreneurship, I should have said resurrecting entrepreneurship, because there's kind of a myth that culturally Japanese are anti-entrepreneurial, they're too conformist, they're risk-averse, etc. If that were true, you could not explain Meiji, you could not explain the high-growth era. I think it's kind of it's a myth. But leave that aside. I'll get into that a bit later. But I want to begin. I was here 25 years ago. And at that time, Terazawa-san and I were both very, very, very young men, very brash and courageous. And so I gave a talk here, and I said that this is only in the midst of the beginning of the first lost decade. I said, Japan will be in trouble for a very, very long time unless you do major structural reforms, and I gave various areas where I thought it was necessary. And fortunately or unfortunately, Terazawa-san said, well, that's nice. I believe in structural reform. Can you tell us what exactly specific measures the bureaucrats or the Diet members should do? And I gave some vague answers. He said, yes, I agree with that, but what are specific measures? Okay. So 25 years later, I think this book will answer at least some of his questions, and we'll see if he likes the answers. Now, to start off, I think there's a problem in government policy. I think when the government thinks about, including METI, when the government thinks about reforming business, which I think is the heart, it's businesses that create value, businesses that create growth, it is primarily thinking about big corporations, big listed corporations, and focusing on corporate governance. And I think it's a mistake, because while that is certainly necessary, it's by no means sufficient. First of all, these companies only employ about 10% of the labor force. So that's not going to turn the entire country around. Secondly, it's not easy to get big, traditional, old companies to change their ways. Especially the most successful companies don't see the need to change, and often they're very unwise. Toyota opened bottles of champagne when Trump won because he was anti-electric vehicle, as they are, which I think is a big mistake. I don't think they're drinking champagne today. So there has been talk about supporting startups, but unfortunately I think that's mostly talk, and I'll go through the details. So Kishida kept saying, I will boldly create 100,000 new startups and 10 times the amount of venture capital, et cetera. So I think that has been mostly tatamai, and I will go through some specific measures that I think the government could do at little budgetary or political cost. I also believe that for the big companies, competition is a far more valuable, far more powerful impetus for reform than corporate governance, and part of that is challenges from new corporations. So this is a chart actually Fukao-sensei developed, which is to say in every country, a large part of the growth in productivity, and this is total factor productivity, so capital and labor together, comes from the exit of inferior firms and the entrance of new firms. So you look at the column on the left, you'll see that 1% of the productivity growth comes from the exit and entry of firms, about 40% of the total. The rest is that existing firms become more productive under the force of competition. In Japan, there's almost 0.2, almost no productivity growth for the entire economy from the exit and entry of firms. And that's one of the reasons why the overall productivity growth is so low. In every country, old firms become less and less productive, less and less rigid, and so you need a continuous infusion of new firms. Just like you have natural selection in biological evolution, you have to have survival of most innovative in economic evolution. The reason why new firms are important is they bring fresh ideas. It's particularly under the lifetime employment system, it's very hard for companies to change their ways to accept new ideas. In every country that's true. The difference is that in other countries it's easier for new firms to challenge them. In the United States, this is a stunning figure to me. that during the 1980s and 1990s, 60% of the entire growth in productivity in the manufacturing sector came from firms that were less than 5 years old. That's an amazing, amazing thing to me. Now, this is an example of the way the corporate giants fall behind. Digital technology is pervading every industry, right? And the important thing here is not how much you invest in digital technology, which Japanese companies boast about. We're investing so much in digital. It's the question of how much benefit do you get from that investment. I mean, it's both. But when the IMD, the Swiss organization, looked at 64 countries in what they call digital agility, which is how much benefit in terms of productivity, sales, profits do companies get for each dollar they invest in digital technology. Out of 64 countries, Japan came in 64th. Electronics industries are having falling sales. Autos are ignoring the EV revolution here in Japan. I think they're making the same mistake Detroit made in the 70s to the Japanese challenge. So that's why you need new firms. If we look at all this talk about corporate governance and how well big companies are doing, right, our return on assets today is no higher than it was in the 1990s and lower than it was back in the late 70s and 1980s. So for all the talk about corporate governance reform, which I think is true, it's not borne fruit in terms of actual better corporate strategy. The result of that is that the catch-up process in productivity, GDP output per work hour, Japan was catching up. This begins in 1970. If I began in 1960 or 55, Japan might be 20% of the US level. It reached a peak, right, around 1997, 1996, 71% compared to the US level. And then it began falling back, and now it's only 58. There was no similar fallback in Europe. So this is not just because the US is doing so much better. It's because Japan is doing less well than even the Europeans. All right. So the problem here is, and I'll go through these quickly because I think you know this, Japan does not have the entrepreneurship it needs. It doesn't have enough balance. You need the big companies and you need the entrepreneurs. You need a balance. It's imbalanced. This is the share of working age men who start non-family owned businesses. And among the OECD, Japan has got the lowest share, only about 2.5%, very, very low. And not only that, but the new companies that are founded, they don't grow well. There's all kinds of barriers to growth, of which the most important I'll talk about is access to external finance. So that if you look at the bars, the columns, you'll see that the size of Japanese, this is in the service sector, the size of Japanese firms when they begin is not that different from other countries. The difference is how much bigger do they get 10 years later. And we can see the US is off the charts. I mean, there are often very big comparisons to the United States, but the United States is kind of an exception here. So you have to look at other countries, like European countries, to see more general standard. But you see Japan's the lowest. So while you can start a firm, to have it grow, that's where the barrier really is. Now, when I say startups, what do I mean by startups? Very often when people in Japan are thinking about this, they're looking at Silicon Valley. Somehow this is romanticism in Japan, that some magic bullet is going to rescue Japan. It could be technopolises or nanotechnology or superconductivity and now AI. And where the growth will really come from is that in so many sectors of Japan, the Japanese productivity is, say, 60 or 70% of the world benchmark. Just by getting up to the world benchmarks, that would produce tremendous growth for Japan. It has to do with company strategy. So on the startups, so Silicon Valley is one of these magical bullets people talk about, right? But that's only a small sliver of entrepreneurship. In Silicon Valley, there are about 2,000 high-tech firms, but across the United States as a whole, there are 50,000 of what are high-growth SMEs. This is in the OECD measure of this, 50,000. And the best of them, they're called gazelles after this very fast African antelope. So in Italy, it's 20,000. Korea, it's about 15,000. UK, Canada, France, it's all about 10,000 or so. How many in Japan? We don't know, because Japan does not measure it. Now, if you think governments measure what they think is important, the fact that Japan does not measure it tells you something. Okay, get ready. Here's the criticism of METI. I've been talking to METI officials for years. Why don't you measure it? If you want more high-growth startups, you got to see, you got to measure it. They don't. So that's my first suggestion. Measure it. All right? Now, again, I'm just not going to discuss this if people want to ask questions. The idea this is a cultural problem, I think it's just not true. Japan, companies have been so creative. So many new products were invented in Japan. The products that are fighting climate change, the lithium-ion battery, invented in Japan. The solar panels pioneered by the Sunshine Project. EVs, again, pioneered in Japan. And so Japan is very, very creative. It is that, in my view, the rewards for success are too low and the penalties for failure are way too higher. It's way too risky to try to start a company. Now, my view is that this today, aside from Trump, this is the greatest opportunity in a generation Japan has for general recovery. Let me say a word about Trump. We're entering a very horrible situation in the economy and national security because of Trump. And that makes it even more urgent for Japan to have a resilient, robust economy. It makes it harder, but it makes it even more necessary. Now, if you look at Japan from the top, political decisions by the government, et cetera, it looks like a lot of stasis. Nothing is happening. But if you look underneath the surface, you see a lot of changes. And most of my career has been spent talking to people like you, and people in politics in the elite, and people in academia in the elite, and business. And for writing this book, I was really talking to younger people in their 20s and 30s. And it was so encouraging. These people were so not only smart, but ambitious and self-confident and imaginative and wanting to fight conventional wisdom and wanting to build something new and wanting to get rich while at the same time doing things that would benefit Japan and confident that they could do so. The offices were filled with women who were not serving tea. They were joining these companies because they knew they could not get promoted at the traditional Japanese companies, and so they went to these newer companies. And these people are much more willing to, they know their value, they're smart. In the labor shortage, particularly of special skills, they think, okay, if they take a chance, leave a bigger company, go to a startup, if it fails, and most startups do fail, they are confident they can get another good job or be a consultant. Now that's a small section, maybe 20% of that younger generation. Most are even more cautious than before because they don't have special skills and they could become then, if they leave a regular job, they could go back and just get a non-regular job and a pay cut. But as a result, there's a much more fluidity of people willing to leave big companies to go to the startups. So startups who need a skill can hire someone. Could be a younger person, could be people in their 40s, men in their 40s who leave a big company to go to a startup because they say, this is the first time for me, my last chance rather, not first, my last chance to do something really interesting in my career and not just for stability and money. So that generational change in attitudes is a very positive trend, and the traditional companies now have to do more mid-career hiring. Second change is technology. When most people think about technology, they think about technology as something which aids economic growth, and of course that's true. But we also have to recognize the way in which new technology changes the social balance of power. So, before e-commerce, it was very hard for new companies to even have access to customers because they had to go through the traditional distribution system. Or if the service sector, people would not even know they existed. And that was controlled by the incumbents. with e-commerce, they now have access to customers. So on Rakuten alone, nearly 60,000 SMEs have found customers and selling billions and tens of billions of yen worth of products, or actually in terms of yen, hundreds of billions worth of products, because they have met these customers, like Notori. It's a furniture store, right? It was very small. The owner didn't believe in the internet. When he passed on, his children took it over, went there, their sales grew 100-fold. So that changes the balance of power. Another example is that this relates to the digital issue I mentioned before, which is that at Toyota, more and more of the car, the value of it is software or the electronics that run the software. The in-house researchers at Toyota do not understand it. And so Toyota has had to partner with people like Preferred Networks and other companies. So right now, Toyota has more software vendors as their first-tier suppliers than the traditional hardware parts suppliers. And these people, these companies, they don't want to be a servant to Toyota. They do not want to join the Toyota Keiretsu. They want to keep their independence. But Toyota has to do it. And so it changes this balance of power. And now incumbents have to think, well, do they not want startups because they might challenge them? Or they do want startups because they need the technical cooperation. And that has changed the politics of the situation. Third factor is globalization. Every entrepreneur that I met, and they weren't all speaking English, so I brought interpreters, right? Every single one that I met who was successful had some kind of global experience. So either they, maybe even this one.
Yeah, sure. Yeah.
No. Anyway, they maybe have lived abroad as a child, they may have gone to a university overseas, they may have worked for a foreign company here. And what's important about that is not that foreign ideas are better. They're not necessarily. In certain areas they may be. But it gives you an idea of more ideas, fluidity ideas. You see, you can look at a problem in 6 different ways and see the solution. So that's very, very important. All right, now, So now let's get into what needs to be done and what has not been done. So one of the interesting things in the digital era is that it used to be in the analog era, which is what Japanese companies grew up in and they're happy with, and et cetera. Most of the innovation was done by the big, large, capital-rich, vertically integrated companies. In 1981 in the US, it was 70% was done by companies over 25,000. Now more and more of it is done by smaller companies with less than 1,000 employees, even sometimes even less than 500 or 100. And so innovation is produced by open innovation, collaboration among companies. For example, if I asked you who invented the Pfizer vaccine for COVID, it wasn't Pfizer. It was a German startup created by 2 immigrants from Turkey, right? And this isn't true in household goods, electronics, and cars, all sorts of things. But what happens in Japan is the government, like all governments in rich countries, helps to subsidize R&D. But 90% of the R&D goes to large companies who don't need it. They're cash rich. They've got cash they don't know what to do with. They don't invest it. They don't need the help. And I'll go through the details of why that is later on. But as a result, the share of R&D done by these newcomers is very, very low, which hurts Japan in terms of having ideas, but it also hurts these companies in terms of their ability to expand. And I'll talk about a solution for that. All right, the biggest roadblock is access to capital. The data shows that if companies companies with ambitions to grow, if they start off too small, they're more likely to die, and they won't grow as well. But how can they grow without external capital, either in the initial stage from the capital markets or later stages from the banks? So then who gets to become an entrepreneur in Japan? What explains that earlier slide, such a small share? Well, who gets to start a company is you not only need brains and ambition, you got to have money, your own money or family money or friends with money. What about the people who got brains and ambition but no money? They don't get to take that chance. And so finance is the big problem. We don't have the VC network is still small, but that's for these companies that want to go on the stock market. But there's something called business angels who supply companies that will never be on the stock market. There's too few of them in Japan, and as I'll discuss, the angel tax credit that the Kishida administration introduces horribly designed and will not work. And then once these companies get to a certain size, the growth capital, they need bank funding. But the banks would rather lend to a 50-year-old company with a mediocre credit rating that they've known for years than a 10-year-old company with a good credit rating. They say, well, it doesn't have the collateral, it doesn't have the personal guarantee. The banks are not doing good banking. They're relying upon the personal guarantee or collateral. And some of these companies have very little collateral. Their main asset is the human capital. And so they need to be looking at cash flow projections, that kind of credit evaluation. When they do lend to newcomers, old firms, just because they're older, get a much, much lower interest rate. The lower they are, the bigger the gap between what they have to pay and what newer companies have to pay. 12% of Japanese GDP is government either direct loans to mom and pop shops or else credit guarantees. And so in every country, if you look here, the horizontal line is the death rate of employer firms. The vertical is it should say the birth rate. Okay, it says death both cases. It should be death and birth, right? The lower the exit of inferior firms, the lower is going to be the entry of new firms because they don't have access to bank capital, to labor, real estate, etc. So, what should the government do? First of all, measure the number of high-growth SMEs, as I said before. Now, second step, this is given to me by a serial entrepreneur. The government spends a lot of money on buying things, on procurement. It's about almost 20% of GDP. And for many, many years, the government, like governments elsewhere, have it set aside for small and medium companies to help them out. But it should have a set aside for innovative new companies, say under 10 years. Finally, in 2015, under the urging of METI, the Japanese government did create a set aside for national level procurement of 1% of all national level procurement should be set aside for these new companies, right? That's 1%. So it's really a small share of GDP, a few tenths of a percent. For years and years and years, the Japanese government never even came close to that goal, or sometimes they buy a school desk for a company and claim they're doing it, right? So then they said, well, since we're not meeting 1%, let's raise the goal to 3%. And finally this year, the last year for which I have data, I think 2 years ago, it finally hit 1.1%, not even close to the 3%. So this is something where the government really needs to go out and make an effort to figure out why have we not made the goal. Let's do the procurement. If they do, these new companies not only get revenue, but banks then would be more willing to lend to them because they have the cash flow, because they have the government good housekeeping seal, etc. Now, the Kishida administration created a tax break for angel investors. So middle-class people who invested in a new innovative firm could get a nice tax break. That's great, except that they have to invest in a particular firm. Well, most startups fail. How is an ordinary person to know which company to invest in? They're not going to invest. What they did in France and the United Kingdom and states in Japan, states in the US, was to say, you don't invest in an individual firm, you invest in an angel fund. And the government certifies that the fund is honest. And the vast majority of the companies in which the fund invests fail. But the few that succeed have returns that are so big that after 5 or 7 years, you can get 3, 4, 5 times your initial investment. So they did this in France, which used to be considered as non-entrepreneurial as Japan. The joke was that allegedly George W. Bush said that the French are so anti-entrepreneurial, they don't even have a word for entrepreneur in their language. Actually, he didn't say it, but he might have. But that was the reputation. Now, new companies, thousands of new companies, something like 40,000, The value 25 years ago was about $10 billion. Now it's over $300 billion. They got a few dozen unicorns. About 3,500 of these new companies are involved in deep tech. So it's a huge success because it was well designed. Now, I wrote an article on this called Learn from the French Revolution in Startups. And a friend of mine who's a lawyer passed it on to Miyazawa, the LDP Tax Commission. Nothing happened, which is not surprising. But the point is, a small change in the design would have made a huge difference. So why was it designed so poorly? I don't know. No one will say. But I wonder if someone at the tax bureau decided this is not a good idea because we don't want to spend this tiny little bit of money that would raise the tax base. The R&D. By definition, you only make money, you only get benefit of a tax credit if you're making profits. So you deduct that from your profits. But by definition, startups don't make money. It takes years to make money. So most every country except Japan has what's called the tax loss carry forward. So that when you eventually, the amount you're spending, say the first 10 years, and by the 10th year, you're making money, you can then take all of that investment and use it once you start making money. In the US, it's 20 years. In the UK, it's forever. In Japan, it was 1 year until Shinzo Abe decided in the name of budget cutting to reduce it to 0. So this is an example where people are not giving tax breaks to the large corporations who don't need it and not doing things for the potential startups who do. Digital, SMEs and big companies use digital badly. Poor companies, small companies, many of them don't even use digital because they have no idea how it would benefit them. METI has a very small program to consult with these firms on it. Europe has a very, very big program. Japan's really got to be serious about that because if these companies want to succeed, they really have to understand what the benefit is and how to use it. Double taxation, limited liability corporations. So I think you were involved in this one, right? And so there are people, without trying to embarrass you, there are people who, some of the most radical reformers I know in Japan are bureaucrats in their 40s. They're too younger, they've got no authority, they're too older, they're jaded, they're cynical. So these people, right? So there's a number of people, and Ishii-san also, back there, right? Same thing, pushing forward reforms and push and push and push. And so the idea of a limited liability corporation is that it gets the protection of a big corporation that you can't take away their house, their child, their insurance policy, et cetera. But they don't get taxed twice like a big corporation. When you give out dividends, the corporation pays a tax, the person who receives the dividend pays the tax. In an LLC, you'll pay once. So it went through, the law to establish them went through, but the MOF Tax Bureau said, okay, but we still want double taxation. Now, I guess it's easy in this audience to attack the MOF, but don't worry, I have equal opportunity criticisms. And the other thing is banks. Banks, again, so dependent upon collateral and personal guarantee more than anywhere else, any other big countries. So they don't do good banking. Now, again, METI and the FSA got together and said, this is not good. The banks will say, well, it works because, I won't go through that because in the interest of time. But so that the new loans, so-called new loans, which used to be 85% of all new loans had a personal guarantee attached, now it's down to about 50% to half. That's good, except what's a new loan? A new loan could be a new loan to a 50-year-old customer. It could be the customer had a loan, you rolled it over. That's a new loan. What we really need to know is how many loans to younger companies don't carry the personal guarantee. And the FSA does not collect data on that. I asked them, they said, no, we just don't do it. So these are a number of proposals. Two other things. All of those things I mentioned so far, I think have little political or budgetary cost. And the idea is you start doing things that create more entrepreneurs, and people see this succeeds and they become more enthusiastic. But also, companies that do not yet exist do not buy tickets to an LDP party, right? A party, to a reception. When they start to exist, and if they form a trade association, then they have access to speaking to Diet members, access to officials, et cetera, to get some more measures, which creates more entrepreneurs, gives them more access, and you have a snowball effect, all right? So that's how you start off. Two things, now these are much bigger and politically difficult. One is, Japanese law says equal pay for equal work between men and women and between regulars and non-regulars. This is not enforced. At the stroke of a pen, the prime minister say we're going to enforce the law. If in France they do, same law, except France enforces it, so non-regulars get the same pay as regulars. They have other disadvantages, but they get that pay. That means it is less risky to leave a big company with a regular job and move to a startup, because if it fails, you don't have a big pay cut. The second thing is the government had huge pay cuts for big corporations, and will paying tax hikes for consumers. The corporation said, if you cut our taxes, we're going to invest more, hire more, pay higher wages. Never happened. Never happened. They didn't do the investment. Certainly not in Japan. And the money keeps piling up in their electronic vaults. Roll back those corporate tax cuts. It will help pay for these things. Now, I know there's a lot of disagreement in METI. I think METI, again, is too biased toward the big corporations. When Kishida was doing his thing and METI was supposed to come up with some proposals, at that time, Kishida had also said, I might want to raise the corporate tax to help pay for my defense hike. And I was told by a senior official at METI, when I said about what are you going to propose for tax advantages or other things for SMEs, startups, high growth startups. He said, well, our number one priority is preventing a hike in the corporate tax. I think you could do both at the same time, although I don't even think you should protect that corporate tax cut. It has not fulfilled its promise. Those are more difficult politically, but I thought I would mention them. So let me stop now. My point was to say there's a potential out there that it did not exist 10 years ago or even 5 years ago. Changes in society that create an opportunity we have not had before for growth of startups, but the government has to amplify these positive trends or they're not going to get big enough to really change the economy. And these are some specific ideas which I think would begin to make a difference. You start here and then you move on. So let me stop there and we can have a discussion.